If we take the height of Mount Everest, we would still have about a mile of water above us before we get to the ocean's surface.
Spend a lot of time and effort developing submarine hunting technology.
The creature filmed at the bottom of the ocean has scientists rechecking everything. Nearly 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific, in a place that has never once felt the warmth of the sun, a camera switched on and caught something that shouldn't have been possible. A soft, pale shape drifted calmly across the seafloor, moving through pressure that could fold a submarine hull like paper. Nothing that fragile-looking was supposed to survive down there. And yet it did. And when the footage reached the surface, the scientists watching it went quiet, then started questioning almost everything they thought they knew about the deepest place on Earth. This isn't a story about a monster. It's something stranger than that. It's the story of how the most hostile environment on the planet turned out to be crowded, busy, and, in its own way, completely ordinary to the things that live there. Stay with this one, because by the end, the line between where life can exist and where it can't is going to look a lot blurrier than you thought. The descent. The year was 2019. A former U.S. Naval Intelligence officer turned private explorer named Victor Vescovo climbed into a small titanium sphere, sealed the hatch behind him, and began lowering himself into the Mariana Trench, the deepest scar on the surface of the planet. This wasn't his first extreme dive, and it wouldn't be his last. Vescovo had set out on something called the 5 Deeps Expedition, an attempt to become the first person to reach the deepest point of every ocean on Earth. The Mariana Trench, and its lowest point known as Challenger Deep, was the final and by far the hardest target on that list. The descent alone took close to 4 hours. For most of that time, there was almost nothing to see. Near the surface, the water outside the viewport was a bright, ordinary blue, the kind of color you'd expect on any calm day at sea. But that light didn't last. Within the first half hour or so, it began to fade, and by the time the sub had dropped a few thousand feet, it had vanished completely. From that point on, there was only blackness, no moonlight, no bioluminescent flicker, nothing except the quiet hum of the life support systems and the slow, steady climb of the depth counter. For hours is a long time to sit alone in the dark, listening to a machine keep you alive. Vescovo has since described the descent as a kind of extended technical vigil, managing battery power, monitoring circuits, watching gauges, rather than a moment of quiet contemplation. There simply wasn't time to be afraid. There was only the checklist and the depth and the dark. By the time his craft finally touched down at 35,853 feet, the water pressure outside had climbed past 16,000 pounds per square inch, roughly 8 tons of force pressing on every square inch of the hull. To put that number in human terms, if a single seal or viewport had failed at that depth, there would have been no injury to speak of. There would be nothing left to injure. It would happen faster than a nerve signal could travel from your hand to your brain. And there is no safety net down there. No rescue vehicle exists that could reach that depth in time to matter, even if one were standing by. If something goes wrong at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, you are, in the most literal sense, further from help than an astronaut on the International Space Station. To grasp the scale of what Vescovo was descending into, picture this. Take Mount Everest, the tallest point on the surface of the Earth, and lower the entire mountain into the trench. Its summit, the highest place any human being can stand, would still sit nearly a mile beneath the surface of the ocean. That's the shape of a hole we're talking about, a place we assumed was empty. To understand why the footage from that dive mattered so much, you have to understand just how confident scientists once were that nothing lived down there at all. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the working assumption about the deep ocean was simple. Past a certain depth, the sea was essentially empty. Early oceanographers who tried to haul up samples from the abyss using dredges and nets kept coming back with almost nothing. A bit of cold mud, some sediment, but no clear sign of complex life. Every empty hull reinforced the same conclusion. The deep sea, they decided, was a dark, drowned desert, and there was little reason to keep looking closely at something that appeared to have nothing in it. That assumption hardened into scientific consensus, and it eventually got written into the name itself. The very deepest layer of the ocean, the trenches below about 20,000 feet, became known as the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, the underworld of Greek mythology. Before anyone had properly examined it, the deepest part of our own planet had already been labeled the land of the dead. In 1960, that assumption came closer to being tested than anyone realized. Two men, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh, rode a bathyscaphe called the Trieste all the way down to Challenger Deep, the very spot Vescovo would reach nearly 60 years later. By their own account, they saw signs of life through the viewport, a flatfish, some shrimp-like creatures moving in the silt. But the cameras and lighting technology of 1960 simply weren't capable of capturing clean, verifiable footage at that depth. Visibility was poor, the sighting couldn't be confirmed, and in the absence of solid proof, much of the scientific community treated the observation as unreliable. For decades afterward, the official picture of the Hadal Zone remained largely unchanged, a silent, lightless space with, at best, the faintest trace of life clinging to survival. Then, in 1977, something happened that should have forced a full reassessment much sooner than it did. Researchers exploring the deep ocean floor discovered hydrothermal vents, fissures in the crust where mineral-rich water, heated far below the seabed, pours out like an underwater geyser. The vents themselves were remarkable, but what was living around them was the real shock. Entire communities of organisms, tube worms, crabs, clams, colonies of bacteria, were found feeding, breeding, and thriving in complete darkness, powered not by sunlight, but by chemosynthesis, a process in which microorganisms build usable energy directly from chemical reactions, using compounds like hydrogen sulfide instead of light. It was a genuine paradigm shift. For the first time, biologists had clear proof that an ecosystem could function entirely without the sun. But even these vent communities existed at depths shallower than the true Hadal Zone, typically somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. The deepest trenches on Earth, the true bottom of the world, remained almost completely unexamined, simply because no vehicle existed that could survive the pressure down there long enough to look properly. What the cameras found, that gap in our knowledge, is exactly what Vescovo's 5 Deeps expedition was built to close. His submersible, the DSV limiting factor, was purpose-engineered to withstand the crushing pressure of the deepest trenches on the planet, and unlike earlier vehicles, it carried a high-definition camera system capable of capturing genuinely clear, detailed footage in total darkness. Over the course of the expedition, Vescovo made dive after dive below 33,000 feet, each one a multi-hour round trip sealed inside that same small sphere, gathering hours of footage from a place almost no camera had ever properly recorded. Watching that footage come in from the support ship above was Dr. Alan Jameson, a deep-sea biologist from Newcastle University who had spent much of his career studying the Hadal Zone specifically, often having to defend the idea that the deepest trenches were even worth the funding and effort to study, against colleagues who treated the ocean floor as little more than a curiosity. Jameson had spent years lowering baited landers into trenches around the world, building up a careful evidence-based model of what should be living down there, in what numbers, and in what condition. When Vescovo's footage started coming through, he wasn't watching for entertainment. He was testing his own predictions against reality, sentence by sentence, frame by frame. What he saw didn't just add a few new data points. It broke nearly every assumption he'd built his career on. The cameras revealed swarms of amphipods, small, shrimp-like scavengers, arriving in such overwhelming numbers around any bait that was lowered that they stopped looking like individual animals entirely, and instead became a single churning, shifting cloud in the water. Sea cucumbers moved unhurried across the mud, grazing for scraps exactly the way their shallow water relatives do on a sunlit reef. No visible stress, no sign of animals barely enduring conditions at the edge of survival. Worms, isopods, and other bottom dwellers appeared throughout the footage as well, many of them species that had rarely, if ever, been recorded at this depth before. None of this looked like a handful of hardy stragglers clinging to existence in a hostile void. It looked like a functioning neighborhood. Scavengers were working the dead material drifting down from above. Filter feeders were pulling nutrients directly from the water column. Predators were hunting the smaller animals around them. Every organism appeared to occupy a distinct role within a genuine interconnected food web, and a food web that organized doesn't appear by accident or overnight. It takes many generations for species to specialize into separate niches like that, which means, in all likelihood, this community wasn't a recent arrival. It had probably been quietly running, generation after generation, for a very long time, possibly far longer than modern marine biology has existed to notice it. Built for the impossible, the abundance of life was the first surprise. How well that life was doing was the second, and arguably the more important one. Under the old model, even if something did manage to survive at these depths, it should have been slow and conservative with its energy, throttled down to the bare minimum, given the near-total absence of food and the freezing, high-pressure conditions. That wasn't a wild guess. It followed directly from sound biological reasoning, and the footage simply didn't match it. The amphipods weren't sluggish. The instant bait entered the water, they moved fast and aggressively, competing and shoving for position like confident, well-fed predators rather than starving stragglers. Fish drifted through the same frames with smooth, controlled, unhurried movement, behaving, as Jameson later put it, essentially like fish cruising through warm, shallow water near a beach. So how does anything manage that, at a depth where the pressure alone would instantly destroy an unprotected human body? The answer turns out to be more elegant than dramatic. Most of these animals' bodies are made up mostly of water, and water is nearly incompressible, meaning the pressure inside their tissues stays closely matched to the pressure of the water around them. There's no air-filled cavity, no rigid internal structure for the trench to crush. They aren't bracing against the pressure or fighting it. They're simply balanced with it. The same crushing force pushing in and pushing out in equilibrium. The finer-grained trick happens at the cellular level. Their proteins are structured to hold their shape under pressures that would deform ours. Their cell membranes are built with specialized fats that stay flexible in conditions where ordinary membranes would stiffen and fail. Their enzymes continue functioning normally in cold, high-pressure water that would shut down the equivalent chemistry in a surface-dwelling organism. None of this required some exotic, alien form of biology. These animals are running on essentially the same biochemical machinery every living thing on Earth uses, just adjusted in a handful of precise, critical places to make it work under conditions we associate with total destruction. And then there was the animal that has, more than any other, come to represent this entire discovery: the Mariana snailfish. Roughly 8 to 10 inches long, with a soft, faintly translucent, almost jelly-like body. It drifted through the camera's lights looking pale, delicate, and, frankly, unfinished. By every prior assumption about deep-sea biology, something built that softly should have been instantly destroyed at that depth. Instead, it appeared completely intact and completely at ease, gliding through the most crushing water on the planet with the same casual control as a goldfish in a bowl. That contrast is what makes the discovery so unsettling in a quiet, lingering way. We might have been prepared for some armored, tank-like creature engineered to withstand extreme pressure. What we found instead was small, soft, and gentle, an animal that looks like it should fall apart in your hands, thriving somewhere that would instantly crush a steel cylinder. There was also a noticeable pattern of unusual size. Several of the amphipods recorded on camera measured 6 to 8 inches long, several times larger than closely related species found in shallow water. It's a phenomenon sometimes called deep-sea gigantism, and while it isn't fully understood, it suggests that something about these extreme conditions doesn't necessarily shrink or weaken life. In at least some cases, it appears to do the opposite. The edges of the light. Not everything captured on that footage was so easily explained. And this is the part of the story that deserves to be treated carefully rather than sensationally. The submersible lights only ever illuminated a small bubble of water directly in front of the camera. Beyond that boundary, the footage repeatedly showed the mud on the seafloor shifting or stirring, as though something had recently passed through, without ever fully entering the frame. A handful of shapes appeared briefly at the very edge of visibility across different dives, some sliding out of view, some simply vanishing the moment the camera turned toward them. To be clear, there is no confirmed evidence of some undiscovered giant lurking in the trench. Those disturbances could easily be explained by shifting sediment, ambient current, or simply the visual limitations of using a single artificial light source in absolute darkness. No responsible scientist involved in the expedition has claimed otherwise, and neither should we. But here's what has genuinely changed. For generations, any unusual sonar return, or any strange shape reported near the seafloor, could be dismissed almost automatically, on the reasoning that there simply wasn't anything down there capable of producing it. That reflexive dismissal doesn't hold up as comfortably anymore. Now that we've directly observed fast, complex, occasionally oversized organisms thriving at these depths, the assumption that nothing lives there can no longer be used to explain away an anomaly. Consider the scale of what's actually been surveyed. The Mariana Trench itself runs for more than 1,500 miles along the seafloor, a canyon longer than most countries. The hundreds of hours of footage collected across the entire expedition amount to a series of small, scattered points of light across an otherwise permanently dark landscape. Anything that preferred to avoid those lights would have had very little difficulty doing so. An unsolved question. One puzzle from the footage still doesn't have a clean answer. What exactly is feeding an ecosystem this large and this active? No sunlight reaches these depths, so there's no photosynthesis happening on the trench floor. No plants, no algae, nothing directly converting light into food. The long-standing explanation has been marine snow, a slow, continuous drift of organic material, dead plankton, fecal matter, occasional larger carcasses, sinking down from the sunlit layers above, sometimes taking days to reach the bottom. It's a tidy explanation, but when researchers have tried to run the actual numbers, the volume of material reaching these depths doesn't come close to accounting for a population this dense and this energetic. Chemosynthesis, the same process discovered at hydrothermal vents in 1977, might explain part of the picture, but known vent systems haven't been documented throughout the trench, so that alone can't be the whole story either. It's possible there are localized chemical energy sources scientists haven't yet identified. It's also possible, and this is the theory that some researchers find most compelling, that the Hadal Zone simply operates with a level of nutrient efficiency far beyond anything we see in sunlit ecosystems, recycling the same limited scraps of organic material repeatedly, with very little waste, allowing a surprisingly large amount of life to be sustained on a surprisingly small amount of incoming energy. For now, that question remains open. We have detailed, high-resolution footage of a dense, active ecosystem, and we still can't fully explain what's keeping it running. A visitor that arrived first. Perhaps the most sobering discovery from the entire expedition wasn't biological at all. When Vescovo's submersible finally settled onto the floor of Challenger Deep, the single deepest point on the entire planet, the lights picked out something unmistakably man-made resting in the sediment nearby. A plastic bag, along with what appeared to be food packaging. 7 miles down, in what should have been the single most remote and untouched location on Earth, human waste had already arrived, long before any human being had. It went further than that single piece of visible debris. When scientists later examined amphipods collected from the trench, the same resilient animals shown thriving in the footage, they found microplastic particles inside their bodies. The pollution generated at the surface hadn't simply sunk to the bottom over time. It had worked its way into the tissue of organisms living in what is arguably the most isolated ecosystem on the planet, in a place we only confirmed was populated at all in 2019. By the time we finally saw this world clearly for the first time, our waste was already inside it, rewriting the map. Step back and look at the full shape of what this expedition actually revealed. For most of 2 centuries, the deep ocean was treated as an afterthought, a cold, dark, empty basement beneath the parts of the planet that seemed to actually matter. The footage from the Mariana Trench didn't simply add a few new species to a list somewhere. It dismantled the entire framework scientists had built around the deepest layer of the ocean, point by point. It isn't empty, isn't barren, and it isn't slow. It's a dense, organized, functioning ecosystem that has apparently been operating quietly, generation after generation, for far longer than we've had any way of observing it. We have mapped the surface of Mars, a planet roughly 140 million miles away, with more precision and detail than we've mapped the floor of our own ocean. If a location as extreme and inaccessible as the Mariana Trench could conceal an entire thriving world from us for this long, it raises an uncomfortable question about how much of our own planet remains genuinely unexamined, sitting quietly beneath us the entire time. What do you think is still down there, just past the edge of the light? And if this changed even slightly how you picture the bottom of the ocean, stay with this, because it turns out the deep is a much bigger and much busier place than we ever gave it credit for.